There was no reason for Hezbollah to do this. The people of Lebanon were not clamoring for it. They weren't asking for it. And people talk a lot about the 150,000 people that have been cleared from their homes in northern Israel amidst the onslaught of attacks from Hezbollah. But what's actually not talked about is the fact that there are roughly the same amount of people, the same number, that have been forced from their homes in southern Lebanon as a result of this.
From Christianity Today, you're listening to The Bulletin, a podcast about the people, events, and issues that are shaping our world. I'm Clarissa Mall, producer and moderator of The Bulletin. In this episode, Mike Cosper and I talk with Jonathan Schanzer about the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. Next, Tim Alberta joins the show to reflect on the soul of MAGA and why Americans still love Donald Trump. Finally, Mike and I discuss the scandal between a New York Magazine reporter and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the perils of a social media culture, the dynamics of power, and the shamelessness in our culture that calls for a remedy. Welcome to the show. After targeted explosions last week that attacked Hezbollah's communication network, Israel launched further attacks on the terrorist organization embedded in southern Lebanon, making this past Monday the deadliest day in the country since its civil war ended in 1990. While the focus of the last 11 months has been largely on the south, conflict has been simmering on the Israel-Lebanon border for some time now, and Israeli officials have said they will not rule out further escalation, including the possibility of ground warfare. In a world that's already war-weary, the increasing scope of Israel's operations in the region has many wondering what will come next. Joining us to discuss Hezbollah, Israel, and their relationship in the region is Jonathan Schanzer, author and senior vice president of research at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Jonathan, welcome back to the Bulletin.
Pleasure to be with you.
So, Jonathan, we know that everything that happens in the Middle East is attached to history. And I want to begin here because I think the history of Israel's relationship with Hezbollah is pretty important for understanding where we are today. So could you tell us, what is Hezbollah's origin story, as it were, and where did the conflict between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon begin?
It's actually born out of the Lebanese civil war of the late 1970s. And we saw back then the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, under Yasser Arafat. He essentially created a state within a state in Lebanon. This was not abnormal for the PLO at that time. They did the same thing in Jordan as well in years prior. Essentially, the PLO got crushed everywhere it went, and it was no different in the 1980s. We saw the Israelis wage a full-blown offensive, pushing the PLO out. Once the PLO left, however, we saw the Iranians begin to nurture a new terrorist organization, building off of the significant Shiite population in Lebanon. This is, of course, the sect that represents the dominant population in Iran and roughly a third of the Lebanese population. And they created basically an Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps subsidiary. They took their most effective fighting force and they created something that was really built in its image. And so Hezbollah was forged somewhere around 1983. That's the year that most people say it came into existence. It announced itself with an attack on the Marine barracks in Lebanon, killing 280 some Americans, also attacking the French. And then shortly after that, we really begin to see them targeting Israel. But they embraced the tactic of suicide bombings. I think, in fact, maybe even invented it in the Middle East. Hamas went on to perfect it. But this group became a war-fighting machine, a proxy of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And the Iranians have built Hezbollah over the years into a fighting force that, by Israeli estimations, is equal in power to a mid-size European military. 200,000 rockets, precision-guided munitions, possibly chemical weapons, underwater drones, forces that have fought alongside the Russians, the Iranian military. These are fighters that are hardened. They exist for one reason and one reason only, and that is to wage war against Israel.
I'm thinking about the history of Christians in this region because as Jonathan is describing this history from the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, there is a flourishing Christian community that is in this region. How did Hezbollah's growing presence in these places change the sort of emotional, religious topography of that area? And how did Christians view the rise of Hezbollah in their hometown?
It's a large Christian community, but it's a Christian community that's also experiencing an extraordinary pressures because of the rise of Hezbollah, because of the rise of militant Islam in the region. Like all Christians in the region outside of the state of Israel, the Lebanese Christian population has been shrinking over the last number of decades. It's an ancient population. I mean, you open your Bible, you will find mention of Lebanon and many of its cities, many of its communities. And it's not monolithic. I spoke to someone this morning who has deep connections with the Lebanese Christian community just to kind of gauge what's happening. And like any Christian community anywhere else in the world, there's a diversity of opinion about sort of what's going on, what should be done about it, even who's to blame to a certain extent. But part of what many Christians in the region feel like is that once again, they're sort of caught in this crossfire in a proxy war between Iran and Israel. Some of the most ancient Christian communities in the region are literally on the border between Israel and Lebanon.
Hezbollah has been lobbing missiles toward Israel since October 7th and at times before. And before this recent escalation, Jonathan, how did Lebanon feel about that? Did it just sort of turn a blind eye? What has been Lebanon's response to Hezbollah's antagonism?
Well, it's interesting. It's gone through evolutions. I mean, there was the Israeli withdrawal from southern Lebanon in 2000 after years of fighting, kind of a low level conflict that at times heated up significantly. And when the Israelis left, it was widely celebrated across Lebanon. Hezbollah had become something of a champion of the Lebanese people, of the Arab world, that they had somehow forced this very powerful regional military to withdraw. But then there was the war of 2006. And this was a war that Hezbollah provoked really needlessly. There was no reason for doing it. They had started fighting Israel, actually, much like what we saw on October 8th, where there was kind of a battle going on with Hamas, and Hezbollah kind of jumped in and joined for no reason. It was kind of a non sequitur, if you will. And Israel unleashed against Hezbollah, was just simply not having any of it because they said, look, we left Lebanon in 2000. We left these borders alone. And now look, you're provoking, you're attacking, and we are not going to have any of it. And it left parts of Lebanon in rubble, billions of dollars of damage and just needless destruction that Hezbollah wrought upon its own people. And I think that was kind of the moment where Hezbollah began to understand that the people of Lebanon didn't always appreciate their military adventurism. And that's actually what we're seeing right now, too. Hezbollah has fired something like 8,000 rockets at Israel since October 8th. Again, non sequitur. There was no reason for Hezbollah to do this. The people of Lebanon were not clamoring for it. They weren't asking for it. And people talk a lot about the 150,000 people that have been cleared from their homes in northern Israel amidst the onslaught of attacks from Hezbollah. But what's actually not talked about is the fact that there are roughly the same amount of people, the same number, that have been forced from their homes in southern Lebanon as a result of this. And so the people of Lebanon are beginning to understand that Hezbollah is dragging them into yet another conflict. Hezbollah's influence on the state has led to a caretaker government that cannot be converted to a regular, official, recognized government of the state. We have a failed state in Lebanon right now.
It reminds me of what Haviv Gur said here on the show a few weeks ago about the nature of these proxy wars, which is that Iran is willing to fight Israel to the last dead Arab. Iran is happy to impoverish the people of Lebanon with its larger goal of destroying the state of Israel. I think one of the complexities of it is, so for instance, the person I was talking to this morning who's connected to that Christian community, he said, Christians have a complex relationship with Hezbollah because Hezbollah does provide this sort of social safety net. Hezbollah is the one that's providing these medical clinics, and they're paying for schools. And, if you want to open a business, you kind of have to go to Hezbollah to get a small business loan. Like, they've created a certain kind of social infrastructure that the country is really dependent upon. And you'll be hard pressed to meet a Lebanese Christian who's like rah pro-Israel. There is a sense that a lot of Christians in the region are kind of quietly hoping that the war results in Israel defeating Hezbollah, like defeating its military capacity, but not necessarily the end of Hezbollah as a political entity, because the country is so dependent upon it. And because even while they don't share the political goals of Hezbollah, they recognize them as a legitimate political actor inside the larger dynamics of the country.
So it sounds like there's a lot of weariness with Hezbollah in the region, and yet there's this functionality that is hard to grapple with when you're trying to be free. And for some, they have known no other life than to have Hezbollah be leading. And thinking about these complexities in the region, why would Israel strike now?
Hezbollah has been attacking Israel for 11 months. And the Israelis have been actually pressured by the Biden White House to absorb the vast majority of it. And as a result, you have 150,000 people that have been driven from their homes. You've got a northern community that has been absolutely frustrated. And you've got an Israeli population that is just not willing to allow this to continue in perpetuity. So I wouldn't call this Israeli escalation. This thing has already been escalated. If you've been absorbing 11 months of attacks, 8,000 rockets and drones and missiles, who's escalating here? When the Israelis finally respond, now they're being told by the White House, this is an escalation and we don't want to stand by and just allow this to happen. Well, you stood by for 11 months and allowed this to happen. And there's no sovereign country on the planet that would just allow this to happen and to continue to happen without a response. So the Israelis have been responding. They've taken out something like 400 or 500 top Hezbollah officials, and they've taken out some military structures that may play a role strategically in a war in the future. But the big thing actually that kind of precipitated this was interesting. It was kind of potentially even kind of done by accident. There was a moment a couple of weeks ago where apparently the Israelis began to realize that they had this capability of detonating the beepers of the top commanders of Hezbollah, and that it was about to be discovered. It's what we call a 0 days capability. In other words, it's use it or lose it. I think the Israelis, as I understand it, were afraid of being discovered. Reasons that I don't know if it was the manufacturer of the pager or if it was some guy in Hezbollah taking a screwdriver and realizing that something didn't look right inside his beep, whatever it was, they realized that they needed to use this capability. And so that was what precipitated the beeper operation. And then the following day, as Hezbollah began to look at its comms, they began to realize that their walkie-talkies were also compromised, so the Israelis had to use that. And then there was this question that occurred within Israel, which is, okay, you've taken out the communications, the command and control. There's chaos within Hezbollah. People have been blinded, they've been castrated, they've been killed. They are in bad shape, they're a mess. What are you going to do about it now? You have this advantage. Are you going to seize the advantage? And so that's what they end up doing. And now I think it's potentially harder for them to figure out where's the off ramp.
It was striking in that conversation that I had today. One of the things that the person I spoke with said is the perception of many is this is an Israeli escalation and they could have de-escalated at any time. And I was like, well, how do they de-escalate? And his comment was there were two very clear options, at least in the eyes of Lebanese. One was to accept a ceasefire deal, accept Hamas's terms of a ceasefire deal in Gaza, because Hezbollah has said, we'll stop firing rockets when the war in Gaza reaches a ceasefire. We'll honor that. And then the second thing that he said was to accept the status quo, which I thought was just kind of a remarkable thing. You know, the status quo was Hezbollah fires 8,000 rockets and Israel intercepts them as much as they possibly can with Iron Dome and David Sling. And because of the effectiveness of those weapons, there hasn't been a massive death toll in the north. There has been quite a lot of destruction. And some of these communities have been bombed out to the point where people can't return from that. There's a story here about Israel's culpability, Israel's agency, that I think Christians ought to be discerning about. How do we take those stories in? How do we think about agency, responsibility, and the nature of violence in a situation like this? I think a lot of Christians are squeamish about war. They're squeamish about violence. There's good reasons for that. War is horrible and terrible.
You think about if we sustained 8,000 rocket attacks on our border with Canada or Mexico, there's no way that you would not see a significant desire on the part of Americans to respond with overwhelming force. That's how wars work. The same thing with, like, we saw people come out into the streets protesting Israel's war against Hamas after the group slaughtered 1,200 people and kidnapped 245.
And literally before Israel had fired a shot inside Gaza.
And then now that the Israelis have responded, there is this thing, well, it's not proportionate. In what world is there a proportionate response when you're trying to get your citizens back when they are being held in captivity against their will by a terrorist organization and there's no other recourse? Telling Israel they just need to accept a ceasefire where they are not going to get back all of their citizens. They're going to be asked to give up, 1,000 Hamas prisoners in exchange for 50 people when there are still 105 left in Gaza, or whatever the numbers are going to be, while giving Hamas an opportunity to rearm and regroup and prepare for another round of fighting. This is insane. Those in the Arab world right now, whether it's Christians, Sunnis, Shiites, doesn't really matter. There's this thing where, like, well, Israel just needs to accept this while the fighting continues. And they're supposed to be okay with absorbing these rockets and drones and attacks and everything else. It's just not realistic. And I think the second point you made just about war, this idea that ceasefires are just good no matter what, or the end of conflict is what we all need because war is bad. There are just wars. There are wars that are fought for good reasons on behalf of humanity, on behalf of justice. Those are sort of purple phrases to throw around, but the history of mankind is the history of war. That is how history has changed. We are now living at a time where there are two wars going on the planet. Big ones, Ukraine and Israel-Iran. And there could be another one coming with China and Taiwan. We see now an axis of aggressors working together, trying to take advantage of what I think you've accurately described as this distaste for conflict, this belief that we're living in a post-conflict society. When you hear the way that people talk about wars, they say, well, they're useless. They don't achieve anything. Well, tell that to thousands of years of human history.
And the thing that I would add is, so often in this discourse, the subject of Islamophobia or racism against Arabs comes up. But I think one of the ways that you honor the image bearing and equal dignity of an Arab around the world, of Muslims around the world, is that we expect the same level of moral responsibility. And so if the idea is accept a ceasefire, knowing that they're going to rearm and continue to carry out terrorist attacks or continue to shoot rockets over the border or whatever else, what that does is it sort of takes away moral agency from them. And that's an unacceptable way to view humanity.
This is such a complex topic and raises so many questions. So, Jonathan, thanks for being with us today. Listeners, we will be right back. Scripture tells us that out of the heart, the mouth speaks, that the things we love shape us in more ways than we might imagine. And I thought of this as I read Thomas Edsal's opinion piece yesterday in the New York Times. He opened it with these words, "The mystery of 2024. How is it possible that Donald Trump has a reasonable chance of winning the presidency despite all that voters now know about him? Why hasn't a decisive majority risen to deny a second term to a man in line to be judged the worst president in American history?" In other words, why do Americans still love Donald Trump so much? It's a question that we've wrestled with here at the Bulletin for some time now, and I think it's worth returning to as the election nears. Joining us to talk about this is Tim Alberta of The Atlantic. Tim, thanks for being with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So, Tim, you wrote a piece recently for The Atlantic about Senator Mike Lee of Utah, and I'd like to sort of take it as a case study for our conversation today about love and motivation and desire. Can you tell us Who is Mike Lee, and why is his particular story important when we're talking about the soul of MAGA and about our love for presidential candidates?
Senator Mike Lee from Utah was first elected in 2010, and he was part of this famed Tea Party wave that came to Washington not just in response to what they perceived as the excesses of Barack Obama's presidency, but also the excesses of the old guard of the Republican Party, which they believed had really strayed from its small government principles and had become bloated and corrupt and unresponsive to the concerns of the American people. And Mike Lee was really sort of fashioned as a true believer in that Tea Party cause, not simply because of what he said, but because of where he came from. His father, Rex Lee, was the United States Solicitor General under Ronald Reagan during Reagan's first term and was really seen as sort of a pillar of the conservative legal movement. And when he left Washington, he went back to BYU, was the school's president. He had founded the law school at BYU. And then his oldest son, Thomas, sort of followed in his footsteps, wound up on the Utah Supreme Court. But Mike Lee, the younger son, did not exactly have that same legal prodigy reputation as his older brother and as his father. And even though he went to the law school and he clerked for some federal judges, he winds up finding his way into politics. But really, even though some of his colleagues like a Ted Cruz or a Marco Rubio got more ink, Mike Lee was really seen as sort of the intellectual engine behind a lot of the Tea Party movement in those early years. And of course, he, like so many others, was initially shocked and dismayed at the rise of Donald Trump and did more than just about anyone in the Republican Party to try to thwart the takeover of Donald Trump in 2015 and 2016, the takeover of the Republican Party. And obviously, he ultimately failed.
But that all changed, didn't it?
It sure did. It changed for just about everyone. And Lee, of course, is no exception. I think what makes Lee's conversion to MAGA so remarkable is that this was a guy who had kind of laid his body across the train tracks in 2016. At the Republican convention, there's this image that sort of went viral the world over of Mike Lee on the convention floor screaming in opposition to Trump's candidacy and to his ultimate nomination. Lee went so far, actually, as to maneuver his way onto the rulemaking committee at the convention, which meets a week before the convention, and tried to change the rules of the Republican Party to allow for a coup to stop Trump from being nominated in 2016. And he talked about the very survival of democracy. He gave a number of interviews at the time that were really illuminating, but one in particular where he said he feared that Trump was an authoritarian, that he wouldn't defend the Constitution, that he could be an autocrat. And that was really striking language because Lee had talked so much about the threat of an imperial presidency, about a tyrant who could try to sort of hijack the office of president of the United States to become a dictator. And so to see Lee's metamorphosis then during the Trump years, not necessarily as a matter of policy, but really sort of more stylistically, and then his personal relationship with Trump and how he grew, by all accounts, to really become almost in awe of the man, and to see him as this sort of avatar of masculinity and strength and virality. Ultimately culminating, of course, in Lee, as we later found out due to the reports of the January 6th committee. Lee winds up working hand in glove with the White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows, to try to overturn the results of the election, and to try to keep Trump in office. On top of this, I would be remiss not to mention that Lee's stylistic change has been just as remarkable. This is someone who was always regarded as this kind of Ned Flanders type, this very good-natured Mormon gentleman who now has shaved his head and he hangs around a lot of MAGA figures like Donald Trump Jr. and Benny Johnson. And most notably, he has become a very prominent Twitter troll. There was a stretch this summer where he was questioning whether, in fact, Joe Biden was really dead and the White House wasn't telling us about it, and was actually tweeting at the White House asking for a proof of life video. I mean, this is a real thing that happened, a real United States senator demanding a proof of life video from the White House. So the guy has changed in some very dramatic ways.
Mike, one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about Mike Lee today is that he's not the typical character. When we talk about people who love Donald Trump, a lot of times the media talks about someone who is economically disadvantaged, someone who has lived in a region of the country where they're feeling a deep sense of disenfranchisement. But Mike Lee is a college grad. He has risen to prominent places in American politics. And I wonder, you wrote this amazing piece for the print edition of CT. And folks, if you're not a subscriber, we're going to stick a link in the show notes so you can become one and be able to read this about the soul of MAGA. Could you describe what is the soul of MAGA and how does Mike Lee really display that soul here?
The basic premise of the piece is based on Augustine's idea that a group of people are better defined by what they love than anything else. They have a common set of loves. When we talk about MAGA in this country, we're almost always negatively defining them. You know, there's books that come out that white rural rage and that sort of thing. And there is this sense that like this is a group of people who are primarily defined by grievance. And so part of my thought in wanting to write the thing was to say, well, I'm going to immerse myself in this world and see if I can get a pulse on, well, what do these people actually love? What is it that actually kind of bonds them together? What does it mean when we talk about Make America Great Again? Like that's sort of a vague nostalgic reference. You know, oftentimes it's interpreted in a very dark way as a sort of a throwback to a time when America was a much more racist and divided country in many ways. Is that fair? Is that accurate? What are people actually about? And what I found, I mean, this was the culmination of reading a number of biographies of Donald Trump, including one of Tim's books, immersing myself in the Trump speeches, watching live feeds of the rallies, talking to people who voted for Trump. And I found that I just couldn't get away from the unifying thing being Donald Trump. Far less than it necessarily being an ideology. You think about Trump, I mean, one of the things people comment all the time is that Trump's positions change on a dime. When he thinks it's advantageous to him to change a policy position, he changes. So what is it that people are drawn to with him? And I think there's a variety of reasons why they're drawn to him. With Mike Lee and reading Tim's piece, I kind of felt like this was probably the case. And I say this all the time to people. When people say, how could anyone get sort of sucked into Trump's orbit? And my prediction is that for 90 some odd percent of us, if we were in Trump's orbit and he welcomed us to the Oval Office and he wanted to woo you, you'd get wooed. The man is a hospitality professional extraordinaire. He's a performer. When his job demanded that he go in front of cameras, he always does well. He understands how to perform to an audience. He understands how to connect to an audience. And in that, he embodies a lot of qualities that people do end up sort of resonating with. So it doesn't surprise me that someone like Mike Lee would get drawn into and fundamentally transformed by the aura or the Musk or whatever it is about Trump.
I have spent time with the man. I've sat in the Oval Office with him. I've been around people who spend a lot of time around him. Been down to Mar-a-Lago quite a few times and sort of watched him interact with people. And Mike's exactly right. It's not just that he has the social skills of a hospitality expert, but he is a performer to his core. He understands what people want to hear, what people want to see. I'll never forget, I didn't include this in the piece that I had written this summer about the Trump campaign, but I was really interested in talking with this guy, Chris LaCivita, who had joined Trump about 18 months ago or so as the number 2 on his presidential campaign. And Chris didn't know Trump. And Chris, like so many others in the Republican Party, had once been really opposed to Trump and was really scared about his takeover of the party and thought that Trump really posed a threat. And then after sort of warming up to him at one point, was really startled by the events of January 6th and by Trump's rhetoric thereafter. So all of that to say that he was never anything resembling a true believer. Before he joins Trump's campaign, he goes down to meet with him at Mar-a-Lago. And Chris told me this story about how when they were dining, Trump asked him, hey, do you like lobster? And Chris said, yeah, I like lobster. He said, oh, give me a minute. And Trump goes over and talks to one of the waiters. And out on this massive sort of gilded platter comes this like 8-pound lobster in the shell. freshly delivered, pristine, like it was fresh off of a catch. And the entire presentation of it was so stunning. Chris told me that he's sort of a foodie. He has a wine cellar in his home and he likes to cook. He's an Italian guy. And he says he goes to these great restaurants all over the place. And he said he'd never seen a presentation like this. He was actually mesmerized by it. And then Trump started describing to him in detail everything about this lobster, about how it was caught, how it was prepared, the different iterations that they'd gone through in their lobster menu, and how they'd finally gotten this one just right. And Chris told me he actually used the word, I remember him describing, he used the word seduced. He said, I found myself seduced talking to him in that moment. And there is just something about Donald Trump, the showman, Donald Trump, the host. I remember people close to the Pence family describing this same thing, that Karen Pence, Mike's wife, of course, who found Trump to be really sort of off-putting at first, came to view him as this incredibly hospitable, generous, warm figure who would sort of bring you into his orbit and who would constantly say, hey, Karen, do you need anything? Hey, Karen, how's your food? Hey, Karen, how's your room? Can we get you anything? You can understand when you start to have these conversations, certainly how people who have sort of a proximity to Trump will begin to view him very differently than those who just sort of watch him from afar.
There was this neurologist, Antonio Damasio, back in the 1990s, who did some really fascinating research about decision making. And he looked at the brains of patients who had had damage to the emotional centers of their brains. And he found that these people had difficulty making even routine decisions. There was this deep brain connection between emotion and reason when it came to making choices. And I wonder if this is actually one of the things that we as Christians really struggle with, because as the Harvard Business Review says, as it chronicles this research, most of us have been taught from an early age that sound decisions come from a cool head, that high reason view, this formal logic will by itself get us to the best available solution for any problem. To obtain the best results, emotion must be kept out. And I wonder if that's part of what we've been missing, that there's this deep primal desire to be noticed, to be known, to belong, that we as thinking people have tried to dismiss when we've talked about the allure of Donald Trump.
I think that's huge. A big part of how Donald Trump communicates has nothing to do with his words. In fact, I think he talks so much, people start to just tune that part of it out. The image of Donald Trump, an image that he's been cultivating in the American eye for going on 50 years now, he understands that extremely well. How do things present? What's the veneer? Maggie Haberman's book, Confidence Man, her biography of Trump, at several points, it looks at various stages in his life when the business empire was struggling. Trump understood, even in those moments, that maintaining that facade of success, of confidence, that's such a part of his image. It's not a small thing that his wife is a supermodel. I think that communicates on a primitive level because the images around it tell a certain kind of story. He's managed all of that extremely carefully. You hear about it all the time, that he's very concerned about how things are going to look on camera. And Haberman describes when they shot The Apprentice, the producers were shocked at the condition of his offices. Things were shabby, the carpets were worn out, the furniture was chipped, and they ended up having to go to pretty significant lengths to sort of create a fake office inside the office spaces that looked a lot more sort of high-end and glamorous. That was because spending money on that didn't matter to Trump. He didn't care what it looked like, because nobody was going to see it. But of course, once it was seen, it had to communicate the fine quality of the Trump brand and to go on to sell the Trump steaks and the Trump vodka and everything else that came along with that show.
And Clarissa, I think your point is so fascinating and so relevant here, because Trump is effectively inviting people into something that they haven't had before. Even for as much of a phenomenon as the Obama candidacy was, it was viewed much more as a sort of coalition movement than as a club, tribal movement. But Trump has sort of created a club or a tribe, or however you want to think about it. And he has sort of offered a sense of belonging and of identity to a lot of folks in ways that transcends just politics. whether you're reading The Big Sort or whether you're reading Bowling Alone or any number of the great sort of social science study work that's been done in the decades since, like, we clearly have an issue in this country with community. We have a real problem of loneliness and isolation. And I think one of the political geniuses of Trumpism is that it has invited people into community in ways that I don't know that we've ever seen in politics. Maybe we'll never see it again.
One of the vignettes that I really appreciated about your piece, Tim, was when you talked about asking Senator Lee whether he would like to accept Trump's offer to become attorney general. And he wanted to discuss this topic off the record. And you said, no, we're going to keep the tape rolling. And you say in your piece, after thinking for a moment, Lee told me he'd have a lot of questions about the job before accepting it. But then he clarified the questions would primarily be about himself, about his career, whether it was the right fit, and not about the man he'd serve. You see that almost tension between the logic, the reason side, not wanting to allow the emotion to hold space. For both of you, as we close this conversation today, when we are interacting with someone who doesn't want to admit the emotional component to their decision making when they are thinking about who to vote for, how do we gently open that door for a conversation for someone who says, you know what, this is about the facts. It's not about the man who'd be serving. How do we begin those conversations that acknowledge the more holistic way that we actually engage with the things that we love?
Maybe a place to start is to acknowledge that some of the opposition to Trump at various stages has also been born out of emotion, and how emotion in our daily decision making can be problematic if not checked, but that it is just a fact of a reality of our lives when making decisions about politics or economics or home purchasing or whatever. You're right in sort of pointing to how the Trump movement has been sort of one piece academic that we've focused a lot on over the years and tried to sort of dissect, but one piece that is more intuitive, more emotional, that it's harder for people to understand. And the interesting thing is, I've traveled all around the country and have talked with lots and lots and lots of Trump supporters in lots of different places and in lots of different stations in life. And one of the interesting commonalities in those discussions is how they can't comprehend why people on the outside hate him so much. And I think that they look at the same thing. They look at the sort of raw, visceral emotion that goes into the loathing of this man. And they think, well, you've shut off a piece of your brain here. And maybe there is some truth to that. It seems as though the conversations around Trump have become shut off in large part because there can be no ceding any ground on either side of it around what has happened over the past 10 years in our politics and in our culture. And maybe the best entry point is to hear some of those grievances, those complaints, those assessments from people that we disagree with and work really hard to sort of try and understand it from their perspective, even if we don't entirely agree with it. But to maybe see whether or not we are guilty in part of doing some of the things that they believe that we've done in our brains. And if we can do that, then maybe we can have some chance at a conversation about what we see in their lives as well.
I think that's so well put. I think getting curious about why people are where they are is a key. I kind of have a real strict policy that I don't try to talk anybody into voting for anybody in those kinds of conversations, because it's a losing proposition, number one. And number two, I just feel like I just don't want to be that guy. But what I do try to insist on in conversations when people want to talk politics, and they want to talk politics all the time these days, I try to insist on getting them to tell the truth, regardless of where they're coming from. Be honest about what you like about the candidate. Be honest about what you don't like about the other candidates. If the political party you don't like or the candidate that you don't like is bad, let them be bad on their merits. Tell the truth about their policies or their ideas or the things they've done that you don't like, but don't indulge in conspiracy theories and fantasies and lies and exaggerations in order to kind of tear that person down.
Gentlemen, this has been a fascinating conversation. Listeners, if you like what you hear, text one friend. The link to this episode and share what you loved about it. We will be right back. On Thursday, New York Magazine writer Olivia Nuzzi disclosed to her editors a romantic relationship with former presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. while she was reporting on his campaign. Nuzzi confessed that she and RFK Jr. had engaged in a sexting relationship lasting almost 6 months, a relationship Mr. Kennedy first bragged about to friends, but is now downplaying. Nuzzi was subsequently placed on leave at the magazine. Mike, my first impulse was a combination of shock and sorrow and anger and just yuck. This feels like the underbelly of culture. Why would we even talk about it here on the show?
One reason to talk about it is because I think people are trying to make sense of it. I think on the one hand, there's probably a large portion of our audience who shares that sort of shock and disgust. They're oriented to these kinds of stories in a way that says, I just don't get it. I think there's also probably a lot of people in our audience who are in the world of modern dating. They're single, they're trying to find somebody, and it is a jungle out there. And in the world of cell phones and selfies, a lot of what you are hearing about the RFK Jr. Olivia Nuzzi story, this is sort of the new normal for many people in this world. And it's worth pausing to think about, what are the consequences of this? Yeah, it's one thing if you're dating somebody who has the decency and integrity to delete your nudes off their phone when you're done with the relationship. That doesn't mean it was a good thing that you sent them in the first place. And I think this is a far more pervasive pattern of behavior than we would like to admit.
Technically, Olivia Nuzzi didn't do anything illegal. It was unethical as a journalist, but she was once the intern of Anthony Weiner, the former congressman who resigned after revelations that he had engaged in sexting and was later convicted as a sex offender. She kind of grew up in this culture. Should we have expected anything less from her now?
I think about that question even, and I'm like, I want to expect more from everyone. I mean, I want to expect everyone to act responsibly, particularly in this case, you have someone who's a journalist. She has a responsibility not to get entangled in a relationship with somebody who's the subject of her reporting. So I think expecting that at a bare minimum is not too much to ask. As a father of daughters, I'm very concerned about the way young women are taught to interact with men on their phones. Olivia Nuzzi is 31 years old. This is somebody whose entire adult life and most of their adolescent life was in the post-Facebook, post-smartphone world. Smartphones became 51% of the market in, I think, 2013. So this has been the norm for her entire adult life. So these sort of new rituals, new patterns of behavior, new ways of engaging, that's been the norm for her. So that there's a sense in which it comes back to bite her in a very public and embarrassing way for doing things that other people just like her are doing all the time. The issue is not, oh, it's unfair to her because she got caught and everybody's doing it or anything like that. I'm not suggesting that at all. What I'm suggesting is we really need to look at the way we as a culture are thinking about dating and relationships and smartphones and social media and all the rest, because there's something just inherently destructive to it. Also this week, very influential pastor from Dallas named Stephen Lawson was removed from leadership from his church and from a variety of other ministries. And that story is still sort of unfolding. But the little bit that we know is that the woman involved is about a third his age. They both say that there's never been a physical relationship. But whatever was going on in their digital communication was inappropriate enough that the pastors felt the need to remove this guy. There's a set of norms here that are shaping how people engage in this stuff. If we think that that's kid stuff or it's a celebrity problem, clearly it's not. All of us have brains that are wired for dopamine, and our smartphones and the apps on them are designed to trigger those needs. And that bleeds over into this kind of stuff. And I think it certainly shapes why it's happening.
You mentioned this pastor story that's come out recently, But there are a whole host of those that we could trace back. And all of these involve some kind of power dynamic. And one of the things that I found was interesting was that the reporting on this story was Mr. Kennedy bragged to his friends about things that he was receiving until it was made public. And then he was like, no, I've only met her once in person. It's all been above board. It just feels so terribly familiar in the church. Talk to me about the dynamics of power as they relate here, and especially how it works when situations like this are made public.
Real quick, there's one other element to the power dynamic in that story that's interesting, which is that the story breaks and it's reported as you just described. And then he is able to get the New York Post. The New York Post a few days later posts the story in which he says, I'm thinking about suing her for sexual harassment because I didn't want any of this. And I was blocking her phone number and unblocking her phone number and all of this. So he has access to this giant megaphone at the Post to respond to it and to smear her. And if you do a little poking around at RFK's private life, which has been very public, it is full of scandal. It is full of affairs.
In fact, his late wife died by suicide after reading his journals chronicling many of these things,
Chronicling
right?
the many women that he had been sleeping with. So the idea that, oh man, this would never happen to me, you don't want to assume the worst about people, but at the same time, this guy's reputation precedes him on this very significantly. The power piece is a huge part of it. And I think there's also an extent to which power has to explain the draw. Why else is a attractive 30-year-old woman or a 20-year-old woman attracted into a relationship with a man in his 70s? It's just hard to believe that culturally, socially, whatever else, that there's other things that they're holding in common that create that sense of attraction. That's just not how relationships work for the most part. However, oftentimes with money, power, celebrity, fame, access, these different things, they open doors and they create bonds of attraction. They create bonds of interest, which men in power have been exploiting since time immemorial.
There's just this air of shamelessness as we've watched RFK's comments about Olivia Nuzzi. Can you think of a pivot point in our culture where this kind of shamelessness began to just become culturally normative?
Shamelessness is the perfect word for it. Because, you know, there's this old saying that hypocrisy is the compliment that vice pays to virtue. In our politics, it used to be that every politician stood up and acted like they were the torchbearer for morality and character. And then when they were found out, they had to go through these public rituals of contrition and all that because they were discovered as hypocrites. And so they had to then prostrate themselves in order to say, no, I really am about the things you thought I was about. I had a moment of weakness, or I had this going on or that going on, or whatever their set of excuses was. What's interesting is that that has changed in our politics. And I don't think you can blame every problem in our politics on Donald Trump, but I think this is one that he's the torchbearer for shamelessness. He's the one who stood at a platform and said, Russia, if you're listening, if you can get me those emails, you know, something that would have been utterly unacceptable in our politics in the past. He's also someone who, when he was accused of sexual assault of Eugene Carroll, said, oh, I would never do that because she's not my type. Not, I would never do that because sexual assault is evil, immoral, and wrong, and how dare you accuse me of such a thing. It was, I don't find her that attractive. I clearly couldn't have done it. Trump is shameless. It's not a bug. It's a feature of his candidacy and his personality. His promise to his voters is not, I'm the upstanding moral guy that you believe needs to come save the country. It's, yeah, sure, I'm a crook, but I'm your crook. I'm on your side. And those other people, they're all crooks. They're just lying about it. I'm just not going to be a hypocrite. Yeah, I pay zero on my taxes and I've slept around and I've done this, that, and the other. And I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and you guys wouldn't back off from me. Because his promise is not, I'm an upstanding moral leader. It's, I'm on your side. And that's been enough for his voters. I think you see that in RFK's response to this a little bit as well. RFK basically throwing her under the bus and having that willingness to go, well, I would never. How dare someone say this about me? The next stage in this is, well, I did do it and it was fine. And I don't think we're very far away from that because we've seen that with other politicians who've been caught up in scandals in the last few years as well.
In a conversation like this, it can be easy to identify the splinter in someone else's eye without acknowledging the log in your own. And as we wrap up this conversation, there's a warning about power that exists here, but there's also a call to something other than shamelessness. And, there's been a lot of ink spilled about letting go of shame over the last few years. It's become kind of an internet social media trope in a way. Is there a way that we can return to modesty? Is there a way to become something better without becoming prudes?
The word that I would want to point to is repentance. And that's one of the missing elements of this moment. I mean, hey, let's go back to the Reformation. I mean, Martin Luther's famous line that the whole of the Christian life is repentance. Earlier this week, we released an interview with Francis Collins. Mostly we talked about COVID and the COVID response and the lessons learned. And I tried to bring up many of the issues that have been controversial, and he's been controversial at the center of many of those decisions. On quite a few of the decisions, Collins says, look, here's the data, here's why we did what we did, and I stand by it in some cases. But then there were also moments where he was able to say, look, if I had it to do over again, I wish we had done this. I wish we had thought more about that. I wish we had taught better, communicated better. I wish we had been more modest in our promises about this, that, or the other. It's a refreshing thing to hear from a public official. Hey, we got this one wrong. You just don't hear it very often. And to me, that's just an inspiring thing. It's like, I want to hear that from politicians a lot more. It would be fascinating to hear politicians who are sort of grossed out by the moment that we're in right now revisit some of their own mistakes from the past. Can some of the George W. Bush administration officials who have become sort of never Trumpers in this age, are they able to talk humbly about the Iraq War and the war on terror and some of the decisions that were made during those years? It'd be fascinating to do a deep dive on a project like that. But I think for Christians themselves, that's the main key. And it's so hard to do because everything about social media culture, everything about the workplace environment that we're in, hustle culture and all of the rest, you got to project strength, like Spinal Tap. You're projecting strength all the time, all day, all night. And it feels incredibly vulnerable to say, hey, we got this one wrong, or I got this one wrong. I made a mistake here. I think it's critical that we start to do that. And I think Christians of all people are the ones who should be modeling that.
If this has piqued your interest, listeners, listen to that Francis Collins interview. It was fantastic. We'll see you next week. The Bulletin is a production of Christianity Today. It's produced by Clarissa Mall. The associate producer is Leslie Thompson. This episode was mixed by TJ Hester. Theme music by Dan Phelps. Eric Petrick and Mike Cosper are the executive producers of CT Media Podcasts, and Matt Stevens is our senior producer. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a rating and review to help more people find the show. Thanks for listening.